Welcome back. We are here to dust off more of the '06 files as part of Five Reasons Sports' continued coverage on the Miami Heat's first championship, which came in 2006, unbelievably going on 20 years now. And you guys are in for a treat because our guest covered this ride in person for the Miami Herald. He is the master of whispers. He now covers, well, now is in Memphis with the Grind City Media. I present Mike Wallace. How are you, man? And thanks for coming.
Hey, thank you for having me, man. And hey, listen, I'm gonna forgive you for dating me. 20 years is went by in a snap of a finger like that, man. But what a great team, what a great time, what a great organization to recap, and looking forward to being with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, getting down to business here, it's important to start off with the crisis at the early part or near the early part of the season because Stan Van Gundy was replaced as head coach by Pat Riley, who earlier said he wanted to be more hands on. There was also the tension between Shaquille O'Neal and Stan, but the official story is that this was a voluntary leaving. What is the official stuff here, Mike? What
You
happened?
know, it was one of those situations where that team had a lot of pressure. You know what I mean? And there was a lot going on externally in that situation. Pat Riley had a lot on his plate. He had, he likes to call them whales. When he made the deal to trade for Shaquille O'Neal, there was a lot of pressure. I mean, when you think about it, just from a Pat Riley standpoint, he had almost tasted a championship in New York, and this was as close that he was going to get to getting back to a championship level. So he didn't have a lot of time to waste with this team. They had just given Shaquille O'Neal a $100 million contract extension. And I know that sounds like peanuts today when you talk about guys making three times that. But that was a lucrative contract extension, a record contract extension at that time. And, they had to win now. On the other coast, the Los Angeles Lakers were just coming off of a three-peat, and winning their championships and all those kind of things. And Pat Riley's biggest contemporary competitor was Phil Jackson, and Shaquille O'Neal's biggest contemporary competitor was Kobe Bryant. So all of those external factors created a level of tension and expectation and pressure and all of those things. And there just wasn't a lot of margin for error in that team. So some of those tensions were self-created, and some of them were external, but they all were there. And I think that created the environment that we saw, sort of play out with some of the early controversies with, Stan having a short fuse. This was his first time as a head coach. The veterans knowing that, hey, we need to win now. And, when you put that combustible group together, there's going to be some flames. And we certainly saw the flames early, and they were able to get through it by making a coaching change and moving on from there.
I see, but to clarify one point, was he fired?
I don't want to say he was fired,
Okay.
because again, he was still on the payroll. He still got his
Right.
full money.
Mhm.
He was reassigned. I would say that was the official term. By all extents and purposes, was he still doing the job that he was paid to do when he got there? No. So there was a job change.
Yeah.
But was he fired and dismissed and ostracized from the organization? No. I think Pat Riley had too much respect for Stan Van Gundy and the Van Gundys, and I think Van Gundy was willing to play along and take the advisory role and the scouting role and step aside, because they had to. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but that move served as a precursor to what Riley refused to do, 10 years later or 8 years later when LeBron James came and there was some similar pressure, and Riley refused to unseat Eric Spoelstra in that same regard. So I think Riley learned some things, but I think it was a different time and a different dynamic. So I wouldn't say Van Gundy was fired, but he definitely was reassigned, and he got a ring out of it. So, and he's still fond of the organization to this day. But there's some scars that probably will never heal from that, from what had to happen there.
How close were Pat and Stan?
How close were Pat and Stan?
Yes.
Stan was his top assistant. I mean, he was the guy that carried out. When Pat Riley had to be the bad cop, Stan Van Gundy was the good cop. With the team. I think that they were close, because when you're around someone and the kind of demands that Pat Riley put on you from a loyalty standpoint, to a performance standpoint, to an expectation standpoint, it's feast or fire. You know what I mean? And when you look at the organization to this day, there are 10, 12, 14 people that have been around Pat Riley from almost day one. They don't leave. They stay.
Right.
And even when they have breakups, they come back. We've seen him in on hard terms with certain players and certain executives, and they end up coming back and working for him in another sense as well, too. So I think that, Stan had to grow up and he had to get out in order to grow up. I think it happened at a time where he was in his formidable years as a coach, learning how to do it. And then he went on and had success in Orlando. He went on and had, some levels of success in other places. And I think that was all because of the relationship that he and Pat Riley had established. I'm not saying they were best friends. It's hard to be Pat Riley's best friend. It really is. And I've been around Pat. I've done some deep dive research. I've did some articles, particularly when he went into the Hall of Fame and reached back into his past and talked to some of his loyal guys that he grew up with. And those relationships were all strained and all hard. And but they still were there to support him at his biggest moment too. So I think Stan Van Gundy is a byproduct of that at a different level.
See, why could Shaquille O'Neal try stuff with Stan Van Gundy that he couldn't with Pat Riley, like being disrespectful, taking jokes too far, stuff like that?
Oh, I don't know where you got that information because Shaquille didn't change for Pat either.
He didn't
I mean,
change for Pat. Okay.
Shaquille was Shaq. You know what I mean? And I think the one thing was that, if you're and I hate to put this on really, really simple terms, but, when you're a parent and you got, let's just say you got an older brother, older son and a younger son. And I'm in that situation. I have a 26-year-old son and a 16-year-old son. And in
Right.
a lot of ways, I defer a lot of the teachings and the mentoring of my 16-year-old to my 26-year-old. And I want him to be able to show some of the lessons that I taught the older one when he was younger so he could teach the youngest now. But it gets to a certain point where a father has to step in and say, all right, we tried it this way. Now you got to hear it directly from the big boss. And yes, my youngest son is going to respect his older brother to a certain extent, but that extent goes even farther when it comes to him respecting me. And I think there was a little bit of that when it came to Shaquille O'Neal and Stan Van Gundy. Pat Riley was ultimately the final voice, and I think because of so much was at stake, so much was on the line, and it took so much giving up. You gave him $100 million. You traded a key member of the franchise and some young assets in Caron Butler and Lamar Odom. And you did all of these things. You went all chips in the middle of the table to get Shaquille. And so ultimately, you have to be the one that corrals him when he steps out of line and make sure that this becomes a successful championship team that they needed to be. And I think that's why Pat Riley was able to have a different voice with Shaquille than Stan Van Gundy was ultimately. And Pat took responsibility for that. And then, yes, Shaquille O'Neal matured as well, too, a little bit. But he was still his same gregarious, fun-loving prankster self, even with Pat Riley in the mix as the head coach.
I'm glad you clarified that. Okay. Well, at some point in the partnership between Dwayne Wade and Shaquille O'Neal, the former became the more potent player or the more potent offensive weapon. But what was it like for Shaq to accept not being the Diesel full time and having to play more of a Robin sometimes? Or more
Well, he
often?
had got, Shaq had gotten used to that.
Mhm.
And, it rubbed him the wrong way towards the end when he was with the Lakers and it was the whole Kobe Bryant thing. And he
Mhm.
wanted to prove right off the bat that, hey, I'm the number one guy, right? This is, I'm the man. And, Kobe never really let him get to that point, particularly after they got to these championships in LA. So it was a retribution tour for Shaq when he came to Miami. They paid him a ransom, you know what I mean, a handsome ransom. So he was treated like the franchise anchor. He was treated like the main star. And the community of Miami rallied around Shaquille O'Neal. He legitimized that franchise in a way that no other player who had come to Miami before Shaq did. And Shaquille O'Neal was in his prime still force that was a global superstar. And so no one could tell Shaq that, hey, this isn't your team. And by that point in 2006, remember, Dwayne was just 3 years into his career. He was a third
Mhm.
year guy. So he hadn't known how to go through the league as a superstar yet. Shaquille O'Neal taught Dwayne Wade how how to conduct themselves as a superstar. And there was some good with that. There was some bad with that. There were some lessons that had to be learned in that. But he didn't just acquiesce the number one role to Dwayne Wade. That had to play out over the course of that season. And by the end, on the court, with the way Shaq was treated, that allowed Dwayne Wade to open up and become a superstar. Because the attention that the Dallas Mavericks put on Shaquille O'Neal, they treated him like he's the guy that's not going to beat us. So if we're going to double up and triple up on Shaq, somebody else is going to step forward. And oh, by the way, did Dwayne step forward, man? And it was the perfect time and a perfect storm for them to kind of have that transition in terms of their roles.
Um, how close did they get in this particular season, Dwayne and Shaquille?
Personally, they got really, really close. And, again, Dwayne was willing to embrace the Flash nickname. Shaq gave him the Flash nickname.
Right.
Dwayne Wade was willing to embrace a different level of how he conducted himself around South Beach and around Miami's, nightlife scenes, because Shaquille O'Neal was the guy that said, "Hey, look out for my guy. This is my guy." It was some things that Dwayne Wade took on in terms of entitlement. That was because Shaquille O'Neal came in with the already sense of entitlement in terms of how you're going to be treated and what you're going to be doing. So a lot of this was the seeds that the Dwayne Wade that became the superstar in Miami, was the seeds were planted by Shaq's influence. And like I said, I'm not saying that influence was bad. It was a good influence as well too, because I think Shaq taught Dwayne how to be a businessman and look at himself as a marketing icon. How to understand that his name is just bigger than the basketball player on a court for an NBA franchise, that he could be a global superstar. And he also introduced him to a world of celebrity that Dwayne didn't necessarily have coming out of Marquette and coming into the league initially. So all of those things factored at the right time. I don't think Dwayne Wade would have become the superstar that he did without Shaquille in those early years. And I don't think Shaquille O'Neal would have been as validated in terms of who he is and the impact that he ultimately has had on organizations, unless he finished out his career the way he did, or at least that phase of his career in Miami in terms of what that championship run meant in 2006.
Transitioning a bit here to Alonzo Mourning.
Mm-hmm.
This time, the 2006 season, he's now a backup player. He's no longer, because of the health scare he had with his kidneys. He used to be the back-to-back defensive player of the year, second and third in MVP voting. But at this point in time, how many backup big men were on his level or better than him?
Oh, at that time, you talk about backup big men, and I don't think that there were any if he was healthy, right? And I'm going back through that time. There were some young guys that were just coming in the league that still hadn't established themselves yet, from that standpoint. But in terms of proven commodity, you couldn't ask for a better 1-2 tandem. And even, not even a young Udonis Haslem, who was in that power rotation at the time as a rookie and a second-year player, third-year player, a 1-2-3 in terms of that being your power rotation. You couldn't ask for any much more than that. And then when you throw in Michael Doliak, who was in there as well too, you have four guys in that situation that you could just, any of the four could have been starters on another team, and they were all there to fortify that front line for the Miami Heat and Shaquille O'Neal. But you asked specifically about Alonzo Mourning. I think this was a hey, I have one more shot, and Alonzo was very humble. He understood his role. He accepted his role. I don't think he would have accepted that backup role if it was anyone other than Shaquille O'Neal in Miami at that point. Now, obviously, David Robinson, or you talk about Akeem Olajuwon or Patrick Ewing at those stages of their career. Yes, Alonzo would have accepted that. But I think because Shaquille O'Neal was the most dominant force in the game at that point, still at center, Alonzo was able to have some wear and tear taken off of his body because of the dynamic that they had. And they were drafted in the same draft. They saw each other through the league. They were rivals. They both got lucrative contracts, hundreds of millions of dollars. They were at a stage where they were building families. And they knew that the ultimate prize was another championship that needed to validate both of them. Alonzo needed his first one, and Shaquille O'Neal needed his fifth at that time, or sixth at that time. Fourth at that time. He needed his fourth at that time, and I think that was key.
I see. What type of intensity does Alonzo Mourning bring to a practice or any type of heat related events?
Man, interviewing, you talk about on the practice court. I could talk about in the locker room and in different
Anywhere.
environments that I've been in with him. And everything is intense. Like he listens intently. So you better have your question frame right. Because if it's not framed right and you're interviewing him, he's going to
Mhm.
look at you and he's going to dismiss it and he's going to make you restate it until it's understood by both of you all. When he's joking around, his jokes have a level of intensity that you got to make sure that you're laughing at the right laugh line because if you're not, then it can be taken wrong. Um,
Wow.
he's just a guy that. And see, here's the thing with me and Alonzo. I go back with Alonzo being around him and covering him and admiring him back to his days at Georgetown. I'm a Washington D.C. native, and I remember when Alonzo Mourning, in 19 I think 87, 88, had just gotten to Georgetown. He was one of the biggest, best prospects coming off the East Coast. I followed that Georgetown team closely with, all of those guys that were on that team. The transition from Patrick Ewing to Alonzo Mourning. And I remember him, having a hard luck story growing up. He was raised by, a foster family. And, John Thompson took him under his wing and taught him how to be a man. And there was always this rough exterior to Alonzo that had to protect himself. Because it wasn't easy being Alonzo growing up. And, he carried that all the way through his career. And he had that intensity, that professionalism, that respect that he commanded. That was the case. So when he walked into a practice, and if you weren't ready to practice, he was going to destroy you. And he was going to make it known that, hey, you're not showing up to work today. Get off the court. This is not where you need to be. If you're in the locker room with them or in the weight room with them, you don't have to lift the same thing he's lifting, but he is not going to let you do more reps than he's going to do, right? He's not going to let you, win the day in the weight room in that way. And then when you walk off the court, this is a guy that will give you the shirt off his back, literally. He will give you his last dime to make sure you were taken care of from that standpoint. So he had a high level of expectation for who was around him, but he also had a deep, deep level of care and concern in terms of taking care of those that he loved. And I think that loyalty allowed him to align with Pat Riley. He was a perfect Pat Riley player because Pat was the same way in terms of what he demanded. So those guys, that's why they're still together in lockstep to this day, is because of what Alonzo Mourning and how he went about conducting himself.
Mike, the Heat's regular season that year it was described as being a roller coaster because obviously there was they didn't perform so well with Shaq out of the rotation with the right ankle sprain, but still after that, it seemed like they had trouble beating some of the good teams. They lost against the Mavericks twice. One of their losses to San Antonio came after Shaq returned. They had three losses to Detroit, three to the Nets. Why did they struggle so much against the good teams?
Because they didn't know. I think one of the struggles, particularly, before Stan was fired, was trying to put in a system that fed and had priorities established. I think that was part of the issue as well, too. What are the priorities? Who are we going to in certain times? And how do I get around to delivering a message where it can be received by veterans who have been coached by some of the greatest in the game and who think that they know more or as much about the game than you do? And again, when you're Shaquille O'Neal, you've had Phil Jackson. When you're Alonzo Mourning, you've had different guys that you've played for, including, John Thompson and other guys that you've coached, that you've played for throughout your career. Stan Van Gundy had to be where Stan struggled with reaching the team, particularly early on, was that sometimes you have to have an audience-centered message, not necessarily a coach-centered message. So what you need to get across has to be able to be received and in the way that you intended. And I don't think that he had the full credibility that a Pat Riley would have, especially with Pat having such a presence around that team at that time. And it was almost like, okay, when Pat took over, he kind of had to undo some of the things that Stan was doing, even though system-wise it was pretty much the same. But he had to undo the way the communication line went. And so I'm saying all that to say that when veterans get hurt and you got to manage their health and then young guys are trying to emerge and they're having to learn on the ropes, in the middle of intensity, you're going to have some up and down. You're going to have some friction. If you look at all of Pat Riley's most successful teams, they've gone through injuries and they've gone through friction. Injuries and friction and losing the teams that they weren't supposed to lose to, beating some teams and going on runs. So it's been a roller coaster ride just because that's just the Pat Riley way. So with that particular team, you had Shaq's injury. I think you had a couple of Dwayne Wade issues here and there in there. Some of the veterans, Antoine Walker, Gary Payton, were in and out of the lineups, and you just never had that continuity. And that team was just waiting for the finish line because they've all had a lot of miles on them going through the regular season. They were just looking to get to March and then April, and then let's get going at that point. And sometimes they kind of dismissed some of those games, and it caught up with them. But when the lights came on and they got towards the playoffs, they knew that they were going to be ready and be there, and they proved to be that case.
Sticking with the regular season, how much was zone defense a part of their toolkit? Because it certainly was as the playoffs progressed.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a schematic style change up. I think with Pat, he wanted to make sure that, his bigs weren't going to be in foul trouble, even though he had a lot of them. So it was maintaining spacing. It was not having guys. And what you had a lot of is, I don't want to say finger pointing, but you had, when Shaq wasn't willing to move, he wasn't going to move. So when his position was compromised defensively, that forced Udonis Haslem and Antoine Walker and other guys to have to scramble. And Pat Riley used to have this saying, you have to help the helper. When you don't help the helper, then it completely destroys and breaks down our defensive principles. So if Shaq gets beat and doesn't rotate over to help, then that forces another trigger. And it compromises how you are defensively. So I think the zone in the stretches that Miami did switch up, and that's not what Pat Riley loves to do by any stretch of the imagination. Years later, Spoelstra embraced the zone far more than Pat Riley ever did. But what it did was that it kind of allowed that team to be able to connect a little bit in certain stages where it was a lot less blame and a lot more spatial responsibility as opposed to matchup responsibility. And, I don't think that made or broke the Heat. I just think it was something that they had to do differently to try to cover some of the weaknesses of some of the other guys.
See, a moment ago, you mentioned how the team was just ready to get to the finish line. They got to the All-Star break with a 33-20 record, but having won 8 of their last 10 games. How badly did they need those days off?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. When you're playing for a Pat Riley team, in those days, the practices were going to be more grueling than the games. You look forward to the games because when he had those days where he was going 4 hours at practice, it was just relentless. And it wasn't like, you're running hills for 4 hours, but you're just mentally having to be locked in because it's film, it's on court, it's listening to lectures, it's having to be able to respond and articulate in certain ways. It's having to check these boxes. Whereas in the game, you're out there playing and then you come to the bench when it's your time to rest. The focus is on the court. You're left alone on the bench for a while and then you go back in the game again. That's an off day compared to what Pat Riley's practices are like. So whenever you got a chance to get a break, particularly at that team, they had found a rhythm. They had withstood the initial coaching change. They found a rhythm and things started to point in the right direction going into that break. And, when they had that break, it was one of those things where, okay, yes, some of the young guys and some of the key guys are going to have to still go to All-Star Weekend and do their thing. And that was before the NBA changed, where you get the whole week off and some time before and after. So it was still a short turnaround. But I think for the most part, mentally, that team needed a little bit of a break to reset and get ready for the stretch run of the season.
When the team traveled, how did the cliques shake out? Like, who hung out with who?
Repeat that one more time.
When on road trips, what were the cliques like on the team? Like, who were the buddies? Did they all hang out together? Because sometimes that is a habit of some championship teams where they all go to dinners together. But sometimes, like the '86 Celtics, it would be like groups divided, not because they didn't like each other. It's just how it shook out.
You know what? That team was a little bit different because when you talk about the vets, you had the vet guys like, you had the Chicago guys every now and then, like Dwayne Wade and Antoine Walker. Those are Chicago type guys, right? So you had them. Dwayne would Shaq would always, wherever Shaq was where the first party was going to be at, right? That's where you gravitated to. So Shaq always hung out. He didn't necessarily befriend the other veterans or star players. He would always be like like a Michael Doliak or a Jason Capono, type guy, right? I mean, he would always be with those kind of guys that were, that were a little bit off the beaten path, right? Then you had the quiet guys. You had, the Shandon Andersons, kind of was off to himself. And, James Posey's and those guys, they didn't really do a whole lot of, hanging out to the point from that standpoint. Gary Payton was a guy that, knew everybody in every single town. So they didn't necessarily have to be together like that. That wasn't one of the most cliquish teams. If I've been around the NBA
Really?
now 25 years, and I've seen cliquish teams, and they typically are teams that are younger, where guys are experienced in the league and experiencing stardom for the first time. This team got together more at home. They got together at home in different things that they would support each other through as much as they did on the road. I think when they got to the road, everybody kind of had their own, sort of mini groups from that standpoint. So I'm not saying they didn't get along from that standpoint. They did. I mean, they really did. They had moments, but it wasn't. I don't think what they did on the road sort of defined any of their relationships because they had all known each other for being around each other in the league for so long.
Nice. Um, the Heat's first trainer was Ron Kulp,
Yeah.
who died 4 years ago. At
Jerseys in
this,
the Raptors. His name
yeah,
and his jerseys in the Raptors. Absolutely. Yep.
at this point, or how much did the players trust him, or the organization trust him? How much was he that guy to really take care of them?
You would have thought that Ron Culp was around these guys their entire careers with the way that he communicated with them and the way that they communicated with him. He was more than a trainer, man. He was a confidant. He was a guy that you can bring, not just a twisted ankle, but a twisted up life situation too. And because of his communication style and he just shake his head. He had that full gray hair, almost looked like Phil Donahue. And hey, and it would always be a hey. Well, you gotta, and he would go into his own life stories, and he would go into how, and this is while he's wrapping your ankle. This is while he's observing a massage, a deep tissue massage, or this was why he was wrapping your wrists or doing certain things that to help you from that standpoint. This was why he was, making sure that the rooms were organized the way that they needed to be. He was as much of a psychologist as he was a trainer. And I think that's what made him, you could trust him because he wasn't going to put your business out in the street. He wasn't going to go snitch all the time back to Pat Riley in the front office. Um, he was going to be able to give you the relationship that you needed in that moment on that particular day. And if you came in with a bad attitude, you was going to catch a bad attitude, and he was going to correct you. And he was fearless. Not many people in today's work environment have the kind of security in who they are to be able to treat everyone the right way. Now, that's not saying he treated everyone the same, but he treated everyone the right and appropriate way. And it was never a situation where a player would get pissed off at Ron or something didn't go right and they would go complain and then Ron would be in trouble. No, it was, oh, okay, let's get together and let's work this out. And I think Ron's ability to be loyal to both the front office and the players, his ability to do a remarkable job at his job, um, is why his name and his banner is in the rafters at Kaseya Center, and it's going to be that way alongside some of the greatest that have ever come through that organization.
That season, his wife passed away. How much were the players and the team there to have his back?
It they treated him like he treated them,
Okay.
and so at his most vulnerable moments, they were there for him, and they would check on him, and he was as much as part of the roster, in the rotation as any player was. And I had almost forgotten until you mentioned that tragedy happened, during that time. And I remember the aftermath and the seasons that followed. And I was there for Ron's final seasons. and when his jersey went and when his name went up in the rafter as well too. And you just saw a big part of him had a chunk of him had been missing. Um, as someone I lost my wife, 5 years ago during the pandemic, and I
So
know how
sorry.
much. Oh yes, I know how much that person has been a part of you for so long in your life that you feel like they're part of literally part of your limbs and part of your internal organs and all of those things. And I just remember Ron, he still laughed, he still smiled, but there was a little bit more weight to everything that he did. And, they encouraged him to take some time and be away from the team and do what he needed to do. But I think because of his family and his kids, they knew that he needed the strength of being around that team. And one of the things Pat Riley did during that season was collect these cards. And there were always these cards that he collected after, and that they would, add some more cards and take some more cards away from the pile that they kept them in as that season progressed. And it was a way that team bonded. And Ron was a part of that. He was a part of seeing that system. He was a part of all of those things. And when someone is weak, you step up and you try to fill that gap as best you can. And I think he was able to do that, and the team was able to rally around him during that difficult time as well.
Well said. Fast forwarding a bit to the playoffs. In the first round, the Heat won their first two games against the Bulls, and they dropped the next two. What was their preparation like heading into the following two games where they obviously won?
Um, give me that question one more time. I'm sorry, I got distracted. I'm sorry.
No. It's okay. The Heat, uh, they won their first two games of the playoffs in the first round, and they dropped the next two. What was the mood like around the team, and what was their preparation like following the next two games they won in the series?
Yeah, I want to say that was the Indiana series, correct?
No, that was the Chicago. That was Chicago in the first round, 2006.
Okay, the
Chicago.
Baby Bulls.
Yes,
Okay,
yes, sir.
okay, Baby Bulls team. Okay, and because they play Chicago the next year as well too on the
Y-
title
y-
year.
Yeah,
Um,
and then they got swept.
and they got swept. Yes, that was the end of it right there. I remember that vividly, vividly. Um, it was one of those things where this up and coming young team, in Chicago was just trying to figure out how good it was, right? And they knew that they were taking on, the heavyweight champion in Miami, even though Miami didn't win the title the year before. I mean, it was still kind of Detroit's, time at that point. Detroit was still the team at the top of the ladder. The Heat were the team that everyone knew was coming. And so Chicago was like, okay, we have nothing to lose. And, when you go out there and you play like, hey, we have nothing to lose, and it goes back to how that season started. You asked me a few minutes ago about, losing those games that you weren't supposed to lose and
Yeah.
thinking that, okay, tomorrow's going to come and we're going to get it right. Pat Riley was absolutely sick during the first 2 weeks of that series because he was like, I am not going to be embarrassed in this round by this young team, and you got to get your acts together. And there were some 4-letter and some big letter words and curses and all of those kind of things. And even internally, it was. I want to say, if I'm not mistaken, that might have been the series where Dwayne Wade and Gary Payton had jawed back and forth and had to be separated on the bench, man. And it was one of those things where it was over a defensive assignment. And defense, like you said before, they tried the zone, they tried the responsibility, they tried to, all of these other schemes and things, but uh, they just weren't locked in to the point where they trusted one another to cover one another's backs. And there was a lot of egos on that team. It was a lot of pride on that team. And it was just, that first week was dangerous, but they were also cool, calm, and collected, though. You couldn't tell them that they were in trouble because they knew they could just flip the script and get it done. So they knew that Chicago wasn't going to out talent them. It was just a matter of, because they were relatively healthy, could they get through and just eventually overwhelm Chicago and move on? So again, they still treated that first round, the initial days of that first round, as if it was the regular season, and they were able to get away with it, thankfully. But they would definitely get some scares as they would go along from there.
I see. In the next round, they dropped the first one against the Nets, and they went 4-0. They defeated the Detroit Pistons in the third round. What did it do psychologically and emotionally for the team to beat the one that eliminated them the year before?
Yeah, I think the confidence that they got when they hit their rhythm in that second round, after
Mhm.
losing the first one, it was like, okay, that's the last straw. I think they took a little bit of an exhale after the first round when they dispatched the Bulls. And then, again, they kind of slept walk into that game one against the Nets. And the Nets were, again, if it was the NCAA tournament, the Miami Heat would have been eliminated. But they knew it's not the NCAA tournament. They knew they had a whole series to go. And sometimes, you just sort of warm your way into a series. But I think that they hit their flow in that series because the depth kicked in. The team moved the ball exceptionally well in that series. And I think you saw multiple guys get triggered against the Nets. And then when they went into the series against the Pistons, it was okay, let's start knocking on this door. Dwayne Wade, you started seeing how much it was weighing on him that he had to be a better player. He had to get through some of the injuries that he had to deal with. And you just never knew who was going to be able to step up and help out on the perimeter from that standpoint. And I think that's when, you know, the tippy toe Antoine Walker, kind of came through. You saw some other guys that were on the deep reserves come through. You saw different guys step up and provide contributions. I remember Gary Payton having a moment and having a game in there. I think he had a 20-point game somewhere in there. And obviously Shaquille O'Neal, was going to command a tremendous presence. And that's one of the things that Pistons team didn't have. They didn't have the front court size in order to keep up, with the Miami Heat at that point. Miami was just too powerful for Detroit. I think they had already felt like, okay, we got one against the Lakers. We beat the big bad Lakers, a season or two before that in the finals. And now, this is another team that's up and coming. And you saw after that first round, midway through that second round series, that's when the light came on for the Heat. And that's when you knew that ultimately this was a team that was going to be destined for a championship.
See, eventually they defeated the Pistons. They get to the finals. They dropped the first two. The first one they had a great chance to win it, but they missed 12 free throws there. They let the third quarter go in the last 5 minutes, and they went cold. The second game they pretty much got, well, their offense didn't do enough, but in the third game with about 6 minutes left, they're down 13 points, and Pat Riley had to write season on his clipboard and show it to them. Why did they have to do everything the hard way?
Because that's just what every single player on that roster, everything to a man, all of them were stubborn. All of them had egos. All of them were defiant. All of them had to reach deep inside because they weren't going to let you tell them what they needed to do. They needed to realize, okay, I need to accept what I'm being told to do. And when I make the decision to accept it, then I have enough in me to be able to respond. Every single player was like that. Antoine Walker never really got there with Boston. He was the scapegoat when they had to redo their things. Gary Payton got to the top with Seattle, but now it was a different time, and he hadn't won a ring, and he was irrationally confident. Shaquille O'Neal, all the stories that went along with him, Alonzo Mourning taking the hard way through his career, like all of these things, all of these guys were connected by that strand of defiance, that yawn of defiance. And so you have to have your back against the wall before you come out and give your best. And that's what made that team so good, but it's also what made that team so delicate because one more step, one more small thing that could have happened could have derailed that team entirely. And it never got to that point. Every time they got their backs to the wall, they were able to figure out a way to say, all right. And as Dwayne Wade said, I'm not going out like this. And it took him to reach that point that it didn't matter who else was on the court with him, he was going to get it done. And it took, Alonzo and Shaq and all those guys to say, okay, I have enough in me to give you 20 minutes tonight, and I'm going to give you my best 20 minutes I can, and that's going to be enough to get us this game. Somebody else did it the next game. And like I said, I remember there was a Gary Payton game. There was a Jason Williams game. There were several Shaquille O'Neal toughness games. There was a Dwayne Wade hero game. Like it was everybody had something that they brought to the table each night when it was needed. And it took Pat Riley reaching the end of his rope and making them aware that, hey, we're about to lose this thing, and it's going to be on me, and it's going to be on you all. And when I have to make the decisions after the season, who's going to get paid, who's going to get moved, this is the moment where I'm making these decisions right now based on how we respond. So that's why season was written across there, because he knew he wore both hats. And that hat are these guys the guys that I can rock with once we get past this? And if they are, I'm going to be loyal to them. If they're not, we're going to redo it, and I'm going to have to make some hard changes, and the Heat responded.
In that type of situation, you lose that game, the series is over, but you
Yep.
you win and you got some life. Was the feeling for the team more relief or hunger that night going into the next game?
All right, and we're talking about the finals now, right?
Yes, so the
Yeah.
finals when they
Yeah.
won the game
Yeah.
3.
Yep. It was more of, all right, let's stop playing. Let's
Okay.
stop playing. Let's stop playing. Because the one thing that team refused to show you was that they panicked. Like, they would never, like, even when Dwayne Wade and Gary Payton got into it, you could be like, Pat Riley almost kept drawing up the play on his playboard. Like, he never even looked back to acknowledge that they were about to get into a fisticuff situation, right? On the bench.
Right.
And then when they were asked about it, it was like, oh, it was nothing. It was just a defensive rotation. And so that team refused to give you any insight into how shaken they may have ever been. So when they figured out, all right, Dallas didn't put us away. All right, we're here now. Now the pressure's back on them. Even though the pressure was never on Dallas in that series, it was always going to be on Miami, because they had the bigger stars. They had the marquee, media market. They had the marquee, global icons and all of those things. But the reaction after they won that was like, okay, now we can stop playing and let's go ahead and bring this thing home. And they knew that Dallas panicked. They knew that eventually Dallas changed their hotel in Miami,
Mhm.
because Avery Johnson was first time on that grand stage, and he thought he had to do something to shake up his team. And when Pat Riley started winning the war of the media, in terms of the messages that were going out, how Shaq was being defended, and then you saw Dallas making drastic changes that they didn't necessarily have to make, Miami was like, okay, we're winning the psychological game, and now it's just time for us to go ahead and put these dudes away. And I think that was the beginning of the end right there for Dallas.
Um, in game 4, the Heat blew out the Mavericks. They led by 20 points and multiple points in the second half. There was the flagrant foul Jerry Stackhouse had on Shaquille O'Neal that got him suspended for game 5. But in game 5, how much of a gutsy move would you say this was to play Shaquille 47 minutes and to go small? They didn't use Alonzo Mourning much in this game. They stashed him. It was pretty much James Posey and Gary Payton. What kind of guts would you say that shows from Pat Riley in such a high leverage situation?
It put Dallas again. It was a check. It was a check,
Mhm.
right? If you're
Okay.
just there, you hit check, and you force the other player to make a move that's dictated by your check. And at that point, as I said, Pat Riley, once he started winning the psychological game and he saw Dallas making adjustments they didn't have to make, he threw another wrinkle in there. And that was more so to give them the spacing that they needed. And by that time, you wanted to give Dwayne Wade as much room to operate as possible. So if you're going to play, these guys on the perimeter, these perimeter-oriented guys, you're
Mhm.
stashing someone on the three-point line. And that was kind of the precursor to the modern-day pace and space. And Shaquille was needed on the floor because you just had to have that physical presence, and Dallas didn't have an answer for Shaquille O'Neal. They overcommitted to him, and then when they overcommitted to him, you're giving your floor spacers, guys that can shoot from the perimeter, open looks. And it was almost like, again, I'm gonna play chess, and I'm gonna make this move and force you to make 2 or 3 moves, and I'm gonna have a counter for anything that you do. I'm gonna have a counter to your counter. And once those things started to happen, man, like I said, you just knew it was a matter of time, because at that point, Dwayne found his rhythm. You talked about them earlier missing a lot of shots or missing a lot of free throws, but Dwayne kept getting to the free throw line. Like, he kept getting to the free throw line. And, as long as that was the case, Dallas's front line was going to be obliterated. And, again, you had guys in that series for Dallas that weren't ever on that kind of stage before. Whereas Miami had guys that had gotten deep into the playoffs, had gotten to the finals. And I think there was a psychological as well as a physical edge in that series that shifted once Dallas couldn't put them away earlier in the series.
Um, the next game, obviously, they won that one and they won the title. But what was the
Yep.
difference in that game from your perspective?
Just the confidence level, just the confidence level, the knowing that, okay, we're right here. And the knowing that everything we went through this season is about to get validated. And the knowing that Pat Riley said, I'm only bringing one suit. When we're going to knock this thing out, we're going to take the one game we need and we're going to win it. And we're not going to have to come back. And, and at that point, it was like, yo, we are as good as we told everybody in the world we were going to be. I can taste my ring now. And I think Pat did a remarkable job of using his rotation, because when you have that many veterans and that many proud guys and that many guys who have been all-stars and starters and heavy minutes guys, you could lose some guys if you're not playing them. You could definitely lose some guys if you're not playing them. And I don't think he really ever lost anyone that was essential and important throughout that season. And I think that was important. He knew when to give guys certain games and times off, but he knew to come right back to them. And at that point, everybody felt bought in. And so when you got to the cusp of winning a championship, everyone could feel like, all right, I contributed to this. And, there were only, the postscript to that team is that not everybody came back for the ring ceremony. There was a couple guys that never made it back, and a couple guys had their feelings hurt from that standpoint. But for the most part, the 13 or 12 or whatever it was that were locked in, to this day, man, like, they pulled together and made it happen. And then I think in retrospect, guys realized how much that season cost them. They realized how much they had to go through and how much sacrifice it took. And not everybody got paid afterwards, and not everybody got what they wanted necessarily afterwards. But in that moment, that culminated everything they went through from the beginning of the season all the way through the injuries, the coaching changes, the fightings, the practice fights, getting kicked out of practices, and the Pat Riley, and like all of those things were like, okay, we've been beating up on each other all year long. Now it's time for us to go ahead and vanquish this opponent, get our rings, and validate everything we went through. And once they got to that point with a young Dwayne Wade who had become a lion, an absolute lion, there was going to be no stopping him at that point.
I see. After the Heat won this championship, how quickly was Coach Riley looking to go back upstairs and have someone replace him again?
He wasn't. He
He
wasn't.
wasn't.
He felt a level of loyalty. Like, he felt validated because, he felt like he owed himself the championship that he couldn't win in New York. It validated him leaving New York the way it did. It validated Mickey Arison giving Pat Riley complete carte blanche over the organization, resources and all of those things. It validated him. He already was a Hall of Famer. Like, he wasn't like, that championship was like, hey, I still can do this. Because again, remember, the lure and the shine of Pat Riley had worn off because everybody was talking about Phil Jackson. Everybody was talking about Larry Brown. Everybody was talking about, all of these other, coaches that were coming up and behind him. Greg Popovich hadn't really, the Greg Popovich as well. He had won a couple championships in there as well, too. So it was like, hey, we forgot about Pat Riley. And Pat Riley was like, nah, I got this other ring right here to show that I'm still on top of this. And he wasn't willing to just walk away from that. He needed a break. But I think he still felt like there's enough left of this team to come back and let's try to do it again. And when Pat Riley's on top of his games, he's not thinking about winning one championship. He's thinking about multiple. It was the way in New York. I mean, it was the way in LA. And once he got to the top of the mountain, he wasn't willing to give it up so easy. So I think he thought about retiring and stepping away on top because so many of those guys that were on that roster could have done the same thing. But what you started seeing after the celebration was that these guys felt like, let's do it one more time. We could do it again. I got one more in us. And when each guy eventually started recommitting, then Pat Riley was like, there's no way I'm not going to come back with these guys as well, too. So I think that they kind of felt obligated to go back again. And sometimes, man, in hindsight, that wasn't the right decision. That was the wrong move. But I think it also was the right move because when it's over, it's over. And sometimes you're not the one that need to make the decision when it's over. The field makes the decision when it's over. And that next season, it clearly was over for that team at that point.
Mike, you've been so great. I just have one more, and you touched on it briefly just now. And but why was it so over for them the following year? Why did they get swept by the Bulls?
That season was if you thought the previous season was chaotic, you know what I mean, and they pulled it together. That following season was just, oh my God, man! It was one thing after another, and it, and then the following season after that got even worse. And I think mentally that team was exhausted. Physically, they wanted to feel like they had another run in them. But mentally, they weren't willing to reset and start back over at game one of an 82 game season. If you could have started that season if there could have been a lockout and then they showed up after the All-Star break, then maybe it would have been different. But why it was over was because, you clearly saw the shift from Shaquille O'Neal to Dwayne Wade. The direction of the team had to be built around Dwayne Wade's future. Gary Payton had gotten his ring, and he still had another year on his contract, I think. And he wasn't physically going to put himself through the rigors of doing that. It was like Pat Riley is a guy where once the season starts, you got to be 100% locked in. And I'm not just going to carry you through a season because you're entitled and you don't want to practice and you don't want. So when it started getting like that, Jason Williams didn't have the right attitude coming back. He and Pat Riley had gotten into it, and Jay Will got kicked out of a practice. Shaq and Pat got into it, and there were threats going back and forth. Then you started hearing some of the trade rumors that were going on. And I want to say at the end of that other season, there was a bad situation that happened with James Posey and Antoine Walker. With them showing up out of shape for the following season, and they got suspended, and Pat Riley put them on exercise bikes for the whole practices. Even when the media was let in, so the media had to see those guys on exercise bikes, and people felt embarrassed, and the pride took over. And when you think you're capable of doing something and your body tells you you're not, there's a defiance there, but it's also, a disobedience there. And I think that team was willing to be disobedient at a point where they needed to be locked in. And I think ultimately Pat Riley had to preserve that team around the young guys, which at that point were, Dwayne Wade, Darrell Wright, Udonis Haslem, some of those guys that you were still trying to build around. And it just didn't, it never worked, man. And they got hurt. There were some injuries. And by the time they limped into the playoffs at 42-40, those young Bulls, had that taste in their mouth from what they did against the Heat the year before. And I remember Luol Deng was unstoppable in that series. And, that was his breakout series. And Ben Gordon and the Baby Bull, like those guys were just really, really, really good and really young and really hungry. And the Heat just weren't hungry anymore. And it ended badly in that sweep.
Mike, thank you so much. I loved every moment of this. I was hanging on to every word.
Yeah.
I'm sure the audience is going to love this too. Thank you so much. It was an honor and a pleasure, man.
Hey, I tell you what, man, like I said, 20 years and you helped me because my time in Miami was 2006 to 2016. So I saw the first championship team all the way through, the next two that LeBron won. I was there for all four. And, I still go back and I think about that first year, my first full year on that beat, man, and how much I learned and how much I love being around that team and how much it was intimidating and how much it was invigorating and, all of those things. And that season right there taught me how to be a professional. It taught me even more how to be a professional in terms of covering this team. And I'm thankful for it, man. As you could tell, going down memory lane was helpful for me as well, too. So it was therapeutic. And, I'll always cherish my time in Miami covering that team during that 10-year span that I was there.
I'm so glad you got to live it and tell us all about it. Once again, thank you, sir.
Hey, anytime, man. Take care.